We've got some questions from listeners. So we've got one here from Luke Bowler, or Bowler, B-O-W-L-E-R. He says, what impact does Airbnb long-term rentals have on the housing crisis? And sort of part two of that is what effect are overseas buyers having on the real estate market, and should government intervene? So this is about house prices and house rental crisis as well.
Well, the Airbnb market does take properties that were in the old, before Airbnb existed in the olden days, that were probably let for long-term, 6, 12, 24-month rental periods. Now there are lots of short-term holiday makers stay in the apartments or the coast house. So it's taking property away from owner-occupiers and renters, having an important part to play in the inverted commas shortage of dwellings, which is feeding into the house price increases and the rental increases. We don't have an actual number of how many Airbnb properties there are in Australia, but it's a lot, and it is actually having an impact.
That's a very interesting point you make, but I will say one thing. I would add something to that. In Australia, we are getting less people travelling as a result of the cost of travel. And by the way, the cost of Airbnb, it's not cheap, because Airbnb was attractive because instead of me charging you over a 12-month lease, $1,500 a week, I might be able to charge a group of people effectively $3,000 a week. Yeah. So, but that's become too expensive as cost of living's gone up, and as a result, we're getting a lot more of these Airbnb places that have been released back into the long-term rental market. But you're right, it has had an effect in the past, definitely, in terms of what's available for people to rent. Chris Johnson, he's asked a question. Does the extreme economic downturn in China impact interest rates in Australia?
Chris, great question. We touched on it only in our podcast discussion. China takes a third of all of our exports. China is the second biggest country in the world. It matters to the world. It matters to us. China is slowing down. They're cutting interest rates already. China's the one country in the world that's cutting interest rates aggressively because they've actually got deflation. Chris and Mark, the annual increase in inflation in China, it's actually minus 0.4%. Such is the weakness in their economy that firms are discounting to try to keep their head above water. And that's why the authorities in China are cutting interest rates, having an impact on us. It's why the Aussie dollar is being hit for 6, why we're at 64 cents, give or take, because China's in economic trouble. And if China's in trouble, it generally adds to our downside risks.
Yeah, so, and we've talked about in the past, imported inflation. Question is, will we import air deflation?
That, and in fact, it would actually not be a bad thing, because when you go to Bunnings, you go to Big W, you go to most of these shops, furniture shops, whatever, you look at the ticket, made in China, because they do it efficiently, cheaply, and if they've got excess capacity as their economy weakens, they've got domestic prices falling, even though the Aussie dollar's down, it can have an impact on lower goods prices in inflation. So that drill you get at Bunnings or that lounge chair that you get, clothes at Big W could be cheaper. It's an important mechanism how global inflation does help Australian inflation.
I've got a question here from Royce. He says, if the Australian dollar goes below 60 cents, which, by the way, some people are predicting, what does that, and he's talking about the Australian dollar relative to the US dollar, of course, what does that mean for interest rates?
Yeah, look, the RBA doesn't usually pay a lot of attention to the Aussie dollar. It's a freely floating exchange rate. It was floated back in, 83, I think it was. So we're nearly at our 40-year anniversary of the floating Aussie dollar. And it floats up. Remember, we were above parity 10 years or so ago against the US dollar. We got to 47 cents, I think, in 2001 as the low. And here we are, 64 cents, possibly heading to 64. If it's falling for good reasons, like a weaker economy, these sorts of things, the Reserve Bank tends not to worry about it, and it actually acts as a shock absorber. So think about it. The lower dollar will add to some import prices, if we do see sub 60 cents. If you're an exporter, you're raking in more money.
Yeah, because you're getting paid in
US dollars, so you convert it into Aussie, you're making more money. And if you're a domestic firm that competes with imports, we'll talk about tourism. you get a bit of a free kick. So the foreigner thinking, oh, where will I go for my holiday? Oh, look at Australia, it's cheap because the Aussie dollar's so cheap. Or we Australians look overseas and think, oh my goodness, Aussie versus the euro or versus the US dollar is so bad. I'm just going to have a lovely holiday at Noosa rather than Bali or California or something like that. So it actually does act as a shock absorber. It doesn't really feed into the RBA deliberations. They wouldn't hike because the Aussie dollar's below 60 cents. One reason, it doesn't work. The market, if it sees that, would say, here's a weak central bank, and they'd charge in and probably compound the problem.
Well, guys, Luke, Chris, Royce, hope that helped you out, mate.